While alternate history is not my channel's main focus, I've delved into it before, and now I'm once again teaming up with Cody from Alternate History Hub, as well as with Mr. Beat as a part of a collab about presidential alternate history. Cody is doing a video on if Hubert Hoover won the presidency in 1920 instead of 1928, while Mr. Beat is doing a video on what if Stephen Douglas won the election of 1860 instead of Abraham Lincoln. So be sure to check out their videos after this one. As for my video, I'm going to be focusing on an election that is relatively obscure, but with all huge consequences for history. The election of 1844 between James K. Polk and Henry Clay. In our timeline, James K. Polk won and had one of the most eventful single-term presidencies in American history. But the election was very close, and this video is going to look at what might have happened if Henry Clay became president instead. I'm also going to do the thing Cody does by bringing this guy back and dividing the video into sections. A poll by American historians in 1998 ranked Henry Clay as the most qualified, unsuccessful major party presidential nominee in US history. During Clay's career, his presidency for many seemed inevitable. It was bound to happen, but it just never did. To better understand what a Clay presidency would have been like, I'm going to go over a brief history of his career. Henry Clay started as a lawyer, notably the lawyer who defended Aaron Burr for his treason trial. Like many lawyers in early American history, he would soon become entangled in politics. In 1806, at the age of 29, he was elected as Kentucky's senator to Congress for 2 months to fill an empty seat, serving a short term while being below the required minimum age of 30. Historians aren't sure if this was because Congress didn't know of his age, or if he lied about his age, or if they just didn't care since it was only for 2 months. He then also did another short 3-month term as senator for Kentucky in the winter of 1810-1811. After that, he decided he would prefer to run for the House of Representatives, and so he ran for that in 1811, where he not only won his seat, but was also made Speaker of the House, representing the Democratic-Republican Party. In 1814, he briefly left his job to serve as one of the 5 people who negotiated the Treaty of Ghent with Britain to end the War of 1812. He then came back and served in the House again in 1815 and as Speaker until 1819. Then back again in 1822 after a small break to help his family that was in financial trouble thanks to the Great Panic of 1819. 1824 would be a shaky time for Henry Clay as he conducted his first attempt to run for the office of president. The once united and strong Democratic-Republican Party was fracturing into multiple factions. 4 members ran for president, one of them being Henry Clay. However, the election of 1824 was the first election in which no one won a majority of either the popular vote or the Electoral College, so the House of Representatives had to pick a winner. Henry Clay, being the Speaker of the House, basically had unprecedented influence on who would win. Henry didn't want to try and get himself elected this way, as he got a distant 3rd place, and he knew that the real choice was between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay was rather apprehensive about Andrew Jackson's style of politics, so he ultimately used his influence to convince his congressional allies to vote for John Quincy Adams, who became president. While this was all constitutionally fair, legal, and valid, Andrew Jackson notably called this move a corrupt bargain, especially since John Quincy Adams chose Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. After that, he took a few years off but decided his political career wasn't over yet. The Democratic-Republican Party officially divided into the Democratic Party for supporters of Andrew Jackson and the National Republican Party for anyone against him. Henry Clay ran for the Senate again, but this time under the National Republican label, serving a term from 1831 to 1842. In 1832, Henry Clay was nominated by the National Republican Party to run for president as a part of another 4-way race. Henry Clay did get 2nd place this time, but he was still basically slaughtered. The National Republican Party simply couldn't compete with the Democratic Party, so Henry Clay decided to form a new party called the Whig Party in 1833. If you want to learn more about the Whig Party, I have an older video on their party's history and beliefs, and you should go watch that. But basically, the Whigs were now the new oppositional party to the Democrats. In 1841, William Henry Harrison became president under the Whig ticket, but he famously died after only a few weeks in office, and Vice President John Tyler took over. John Tyler was a Whig in name, but not in policy, and he was so frustrating that Henry Clay resigned his Senate seat in protest. But in 1844, Henry Clay decided to try a third attempt at the presidency, running against James K. Polk. It was close. Henry Clay only lost by 1.5% of the vote, or around 39,000 people. Henry Clay then experienced an awful event when his son Henry Jr. died in the Mexican-American War in 1847, a war Henry Clay had greatly opposed in the first place. In 1848, Henry Clay once again planned to run for president for a fourth time, but this time he would lose the nomination to Zachary Taylor, and wouldn't even make it to the national level. Henry Clay then went back to the Senate in 1849 until his death in 1852. Talk about a career politician. During his time in Congress, Clay was known as being somewhat of a political genius. He was excellent with creating alliances to help pass legislation, he was an expert at breaking up attempts at obstruction, and in spite of all of that, he was also noted for being considered fair as a House Speaker. He was also seen as the Great Compromiser, known for somehow finding the perfect legislative compromise to please a divided Congress. However, like anyone else, Clay was complicated and had his flaws. Clay was in the group of people who were generally opposed to slavery, but owned slaves anyway. Henry Clay's stance was similar to basically saying, "Oh, I don't like it, but there's no other alternative." He even at one point when someone challenged him to give up his slaves to match his anti-slavery views retorted by saying, "That's no different than telling me to sell my farm." While that is certainly not even close to any sort of a valid excuse, it was nevertheless a common stance many people had in the early 1800s. Henry Clay did, however, support recognition for Haiti, which was very unprecedented for a Southern congressman. He also grew to support the idea of gradual abolition of slavery for his state of Kentucky, a method of abolition that worked for many northern states in previous decades. Clay's hypocrisy on slavery in many ways translated to his efforts of desperately trying to make sure slavery wouldn't be the thing to tear the United States apart. Living up to the Great Compromiser name, Henry Clay is basically responsible for passing the 1820 Missouri Compromise, which served as a sacred guide to kick the issue of slavery down the road for the next few decades by dividing America into the free North and the slave South. He also would be responsible with teaming up with Stephen Douglas to pass the Compromise of 1850. I also weirdly noticed a lot of general similarities with Hillary Clinton, weirdly enough. To sum it up, Henry Clay was an extremely influential political figure for the antebellum period in America. So for this alternate history scenario, we're going to look into what would happen if Henry Clay became president. More specifically, the election of 1844. It was the closest Henry Clay had to winning, and it has the most consequences. So why did Clay lose the election of 1844? Because he said his opinions out loud too much. As shocking as it sounds, during this time people didn't want an openly partisan president. Yes, there were political parties, but a president was supposed to represent everyone. It was one thing to make an outline of what you plan to do as president, that's perfectly fine. But making statements about how you think X policy is dumb, that didn't go over very well at the time. Henry Clay in particular was vocal against the annexation of Texas. I already brought up his complicated stances on slavery, but part of the whole point of the Missouri Compromise was to settle the issue, and expanding westward from the South would upset everything again. He was a bit too vocal about it, and it turned enough people off to make the difference. The sad thing is John Tyler in his final days of office approved the annexation of Texas, which ended up making it a moot point anyway. Henry Clay may have been against it, but he wouldn't be the type to scrap an already approved agreement like that. So we'll say for this election that Henry Clay simply kept his mouth shut, and it gave him the extra percentage he needed to flip a state or two and win. Easy enough. But now that Texas is a part of the United States, what will Henry Clay do? While Texas is settled, Henry Clay certainly wouldn't go to war with Mexico. He was vocal against it in our timeline, and he'd be in this one too. So the Great Compromiser does what he did best: compromise. The war with Mexico arose over a border dispute between the Republic of Texas and Mexico. Texas only controlled this area up to the Nueces River, but claimed everything to the Rio Grande. Polk during his presidency chose to interpret annexing Texas as annexing everything up to the Rio Grande, which sparked the war. Henry Clay wouldn't do that by any means. To avoid war, he would be open to negotiations to fix the disputed border. In fact, it was even Texan policy that if the border became an issue with Mexico, Texas would be willing to compromise by placing the border along where the watersheds of the Rio Grande and Nueces rivers meet. They were even willing to ignore Mexican New Mexico entirely. So in this timeline, Henry Clay manages to negotiate this boundary, and by doing so, avoids war with Mexico entirely, and all within his first half year in office. People often forget that the Polk administration also oversaw the US acquiring modern-day Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. The area known as the Oregon Territory included those three areas as well as a huge chunk of British Columbia. Since 1819, both the United States and the British jointly occupied the territory, but over time there were desires to simply partition it or take all of it. In our timeline, the British lobbied for a compromise to simply extend the border all the way across, and Congress agreed to recommend that to Polk, who accepted because he didn't want to be distracted from a war with Mexico. I imagine in this timeline, the idea of yet another compromise to solve a border issue being on Henry Clay's desk would be just perfect for him. So I imagine this still happens in 1846 with nothing changing. However, this would still inevitably cause a bit of unexpected trouble with the issue of slavery down the line. The Missouri Compromise was a sacred rule, but boy did Congress find ways to complain about it whenever there was an irregularity. In our timeline, California and Texas caused issues, but here we have the northern free areas expanding westward, potentially leading the way for new free states, while the South was halted at Texas, unable to expand slavery, putting the precious balance at risk in the future. Without a war with Mexico, this fervor was going to go somewhere. In the 19th century, there were a few cases of settlers from the United States either trying to mass settle a place or to hire an army to conquer a place to hopefully get it to economically support US interests, or even sometimes secede altogether and try to join the United States. Kinda similar to how Texas left Mexico, except blunter and more sporadic. One example was when William Walker just took over Nicaragua with a small army in the 1850s and put himself in charge. The US recognized his regime, but he got driven out after a year. You also may have heard about how many Southerners were frothing at the mouth to acquire Cuba for decades. There could be multiple reasons. There could be just general business interests, there could be general expansionist interests, and in some cases there was also the interest to expand slave interests. Expanding slave interests in Central America was certainly not outside of the realm of possibility. One of these cases was the Yucatan Peninsula. While the Yucatan is traditionally a part of Mexico, the Yucatan actually broke off as its own republic in 1841. In 1847, however, there was a revolt of the Maya population known as the Caste War. In our timeline, the Yucatan Republic couldn't suppress the revolt, so they tried asking the United States for military help. They were willing to even become a state of the United States in exchange for military aid. James K. Polk was interested, and the House voted yes, but the Senate voted no because they didn't want to divert resources from the war with Mexico. So instead, the Yucatan gave the same offer to Mexico, and Mexico retook the Yucatan. However, the Maya along the southern coast would declare independence and keep clashing with Mexico on and off all the way until 1915 when they finally fell. During the initial revolt, many American mercenaries went there to fight the revolt, with the hopes of still making an American annexation possible. But most slave interests focused on new territory acquired from Mexico and California. In this timeline, Henry Clay might be interested in Yucatan statehood to balance out the acquisition of the Oregon country, but he wouldn't want a war and would still refuse this deal. This would cause more mercenaries to go down there to suppress the Maya revolt, since this is seen as the best hope for expanding slavery. If the US government isn't willing to fight, maybe they'd still annex the Yucatan in peacetime. It was certainly an easier option than Cuba. Perhaps this goes the same way as Mexico's intervention does. The Maya are driven to coastal areas and there's a stalemate. The slavery interests use this to lobby for annexation again without asking for military aid. And by this time they would outnumber the interests of anyone else. Henry Clay perhaps would not want to cause trouble with the slavery issue and wouldn't want to worry about future conflicts dealing with another possible Mayan revolt. But the southern states would complain about the Oregon country. So Henry Clay comes up with the Yucatan Compromise of 1848. The Yucatan joins the US as a slave state, but to prevent future conflicts also agrees to recognize the independence of the Mayan state of Cruzab. Borders are negotiated and Henry Clay has once again come up with a temporary solution that'll work for the time being. Would this fix all the problems and make the Maya happy? Obviously not, but for Yucatan annexation, the slave interests really only care about being another slave state, and don't see any problem with this, so it works. Henry Clay may not have wanted war, but he also cared more about keeping the balance than anything else. So, yeah, Henry Clay's first term in office is super eventful, but is it enough to win a second term? So, James K. Polk promised to only be president for one term. However, since he lost 1844, I'm not sure if he'd run again in 1848. It's possible someone else could be the nominee in 1848, but regardless of who would run again, Clay's expansion of the US, even if peaceful, would still be enough to satisfy pro-expansionist Americans for the time being. So regardless of who the Democrats nominate in 1848, I don't see Henry Clay not winning a second term. And with expansionists satisfied and the state balance kept for the time being, I imagine Clay's second term would focus on his usual love of infrastructure and would remain quiet. But there would be one thing to note. So, the Mormons in the 1840s were migrating to modern-day Utah. It was their original plan to go there while it was Mexican frontier territory to achieve isolation and avoid persecution. They'd have a better chance to form their own community and run their own affairs. Since the US never ends up taking Utah in this timeline, maybe they make an offer to Santa Anna to form their own state of Deseret for Mexico. Maybe they attempt a revolt Texas-style for their own nation. Honestly, I'm not sure, but I'm leaning towards revolt simply because I can't imagine Mexico accepting Mormon beliefs in their territory or wanting a future Texas problem anyway. So the Mormons at some point try to fight for their independence. How does it go? Does Santa Anna lose his other leg? No idea. Regardless, President Clay certainly isn't getting involved. But it's a fun little side quest to think about. So Henry Clay was the type to work well past when most people would. In our timeline, his health declined in 1851, and he finally decided to set a retirement date in the Senate for September of 1852, but ended up dying in June after catching a sickness in DC. While I don't know for sure if he'd still catch it in this timeline, his health is still fading regardless, and I can't imagine being the president helps. If Clay dies in office before his second term ends, his vice president Theodore Frelinghuysen takes office and becomes president for a few months. Wait, why only a few months? Yeah, so Frelinghuysen wasn't popular. Clay was surprised he even made the vice presidential nomination, and this was before presidents chose their running mate, so in a way he was stuck with him. Frelinghuysen disliked Catholics, was extremely racist against black people, and was against the Indian Removal Act when it occurred under Jackson. You could probably guess which two of those three alienated voters at the time. But more importantly, the Democrats in 1852 were still very likely going to choose Franklin Pierce, mainly because the Democratic Party was divided between Lewis Cass, Stephen Douglas, and James Buchanan. For the nomination process, they had 49 votes, and those three went back and forth on having the lead, but not the majority. Eventually, by vote 35, some started to vote for Pierce as a dark horse compromise candidate, and eventually the deadlock was so unbreakable that everyone on the 49th ballot finally gave up and just voted for Franklin Pierce. I suppose it's possible in this scenario for someone else to become the dark horse candidate, but I'm sticking with Pierce. In our timeline, Winfield Scott proved very unpopular with his platform for the Whig Party, and Pierce won in a landslide. With Frelinghuysen also being unpopular, I don't see a Franklin Pierce landslide not happening. While there wasn't a compromise of 1850 in this one, there would still be a Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which would destroy the Missouri Compromise and reopen the battle for free versus slave states on the Great Plains. Part of the reason why the American Civil War is basically inevitable is that every politician was either exacerbating the expansion of slavery or kicked the can down the road. Henry Clay certainly changed events with American expansionism, but he was never going to compromise his way out of slavery forever. Henry Clay was the Whig Party, and the Whig Party fell apart over slavery after his death, and I don't see that still not happening. Texas is smaller and there's no California, but there would still be a time when the new anti-slavery Republican Party wins and the South decides to secede. If the South does secede in 1861, then the Civil War isn't exactly going to be all that different. After all, there weren't any essential battles of the Civil War west of Louisiana. I don't know, maybe there's a weird set of battles in the Yucatan if the Yucatan secedes too. Either way, some things just don't change. But hey, at least the Maya have a state, that's kinda cool. I hope you enjoyed that scenario, and if you did, you should see the other alternate history videos that Mr. B and Alternate History Hub made for this collaboration. But before you go, thanks for watching. If you buy a plushie, it helps support the channel, and they're only here for a limited time. We need to hit enough orders for them to be produced, so your support really means a lot.